My name is Paige Reynolds. I am 33 years old and a corporate restructuring attorney at a top firm in Manhattan. 2 hours after surviving an emergency surgical delivery, I looked at my husband expecting him to hold our newborn daughter. Instead, he leaned over the sterile hospital bed and whispered that he already had a son with another woman and would never acknowledge my child. I did not scream or cry. I simply smiled, looked him dead in the eyes, and whispered that he needed to remember this exact moment. The next morning, that same arrogant man was on his knees in the hospital lobby, hysterically begging me for one more chance. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to ruthlessly stand up to people who thought they could break you. The fluorescent lights of the maternity ward glared harshly against the white ceiling tiles as the numbness of the spinal block slowly began to wear off. The physical agony of having my abdomen cut open was just beginning to register, sending sharp waves of burning pain through my core with every shallow breath I took. Across the room, nestled in a clear plastic hospital bassinet, slept my newborn daughter Lily. She was tiny and perfect, wrapped tightly in a striped blanket. I was physically depleted, shivering from the aftermath of major surgery, but my heart swelled with an overwhelming need to hold her. I turned my head heavily toward the window where my husband Brandon stood. He was 35 years old, a portfolio manager who prided himself on projecting an image of Wall Street dominance. He wore a crisp, custom-tailored navy suit that looked completely absurd in the clinical setting of a recovery room. He had not taken off his jacket. He had not washed his hands. He had not even stepped close enough to look at the child we had supposedly spent 2 years trying to conceive. I asked him to bring our daughter to me. My voice was raspy, barely more than a dry whisper. Brandon turned away from the window, checking his heavy gold watch before walking toward my bed. He completely bypassed the bassinet. He stepped right up to the metal guardrail of my bed, his face an absolute mask of cold contempt. The expensive scent of his cologne wafted over me, suddenly turning my stomach. He leaned down close to my face, ensuring the nurses outside the door could not hear his voice. He stated with chilling clarity that he already had a 2-year-old son with a woman he actually loved. He looked at the bassinet and called our newborn daughter a biological inconvenience. He told me flatly that she would never see a single dime of the Reynolds family legacy and that he refused to put his name on her birth certificate. Most women would have shattered in that exact second. Most women would have screamed for help, dissolved into hysterical tears, or begged their husband to explain what kind of sick joke he was playing. But I am not most women. As a corporate restructuring attorney, I specialize in dismantling hostile takeovers, liquidating toxic assets, and destroying aggressive predators in federal court. You learn very quickly how to detach human emotion from raw strategic calculation. The moment those words left his mouth, the terrified, exhausted mother inside me shut down completely. The ruthless attorney took the wheel. I did not shed a single tear. I analyzed his rigid posture, the slight tremor of adrenaline in his jaw, the sheer audacity of his timing. I realized the man I had shared my life with was nothing but a financial parasite who believed he had finally caught his prey at her absolute weakest physical moment. I looked up at him, my expression completely neutral, and allowed a cold, calculating smile to touch my lips. I told him to remember this second. I told him to burn this exact visual into his memory because it would be the very last time he ever held the upper hand in my presence. Brandon scoffed loudly, adjusting his French cuffs with an arrogant flick of his wrists. He clearly thought I was just a delusional, hormone-addled woman trying to sound tough from a hospital bed. He drastically underestimated the situation. He forgot that he had just declared war on a woman who engineered multi-billion-dollar corporate bloodbaths before her morning coffee. He did not even give me time to process his horrific confession. While I was still bleeding, hooked up to an intravenous drip, and fighting off waves of medical exhaustion, Brandon reached down and picked up his leather briefcase from the floor. He snapped the brass locks open, pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents, and dropped them heavily onto my lap. It was a post-nuptial agreement. He pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and demanded I sign the paperwork right there on the spot. The sheer evil of his premeditated attack was staggering. I looked down at the contract resting on my hospital blanket. The key stipulations were aggressively highlighted in bright yellow ink. He was demanding that I sign away my sole financial guardianship over my Manhattan penthouse. That property was worth $4.5 million. It was purchased entirely with funds from a private trust left to me by my late father before I ever met Brandon. It was legally protected as completely separate property under my prenuptial agreement. Brandon knew this perfectly well. He also knew that if he could manipulate me into signing this new document while I was isolated and under medical duress, he could potentially force a legal claim over the real estate. He leaned in even closer, his breath hot against my cheek, and delivered his ultimate extortion threat. If I refused to sign away my home immediately, he would file for an aggressive divorce the next morning and petition the family court for full custody of Lily. He threatened to use my current medical state against me, claiming he would bring in witnesses to testify that I was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis and was entirely unfit to be a mother. The psychological cruelty of his plan was almost impressive, but legally, it was a complete joke. As my eyes skimmed the highlighted clauses of the contract, my trained legal mind instantly caught a dozen fatal errors. The document had clearly been drafted by a sloppy bargain rate attorney. It was riddled with contradictory loopholes and unenforceable mandates. Furthermore, attempting to force a signature from a patient who is actively recovering from major surgery and currently under the influence of powerful narcotic painkillers instantly invalidates any legal contract under New York state law due to fraudulent medical duress. Brandon was an absolute fool. This man, whose entire identity and career were built on projecting an image of generational wealth and financial genius, was actually drowning in toxic debt. Just 1 year ago, I had quietly liquidated a massive portion of my own private stock portfolio to bail him out of a $1.2 million margin call. I had saved him from absolute federal ruin and public disgrace simply to protect the peace of our household. Now, instead of gratitude, he was trying to extort me for the remainder of my father's inheritance. I kept my facial muscles perfectly relaxed. I slowly reached out and took the silver pen from his hand, intentionally letting my fingers shake slightly. I played the part of the terrified, broken, submissive wife he so desperately needed me to be. I whispered that I just needed a little bit of time to read through the terms, because my vision was blurry from the medication. Brandon laughed, a harsh and entirely dismissive sound echoing off the sterile walls. He told me my time was up and ordered me to sign the bottom line immediately. Before I could formulate another stalling tactic, the heavy wooden door to my recovery room flew violently open. It hit the rubber wall stop with a loud crack that echoed over the steady hum of my heart monitor. In marched my mother-in-law, Loretta. She strode into the room with the arrogant entitlement of a queen inspecting a conquered province. She wore a heavy fur coat that she had refused to check at the front desk, completely disregarding the hospital's sanitation protocols. Trailing closely behind her was a younger woman I had never seen before, whose hand was tightly gripping the arm of a toddler boy who looked to be about 2 years old. This was Melanie the mistress, and Leo the hidden son Brandon had just boasted about. Loretta did not even bother to look at my face or ask about my surgical recovery. She marched straight past the foot of my bed and approached the clear plastic bassinet where my newborn daughter was sleeping. Without a single ounce of hesitation or human decency, Loretta grabbed the edge of the bassinet and shoved it roughly toward the far corner of the room. The plastic wheels squeaked violently against the linoleum floor as the small bed hit the wall. She did this simply to clear a space for Melanie to sit down on the visitor chair. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect of physically pushing a newborn baby aside made my blood run entirely cold, but I maintained my absolute terrifying silence. Loretta crossed her arms over her fur coat and glared down at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. She proudly announced to the room that she had already paid for a private, expedited DNA test weeks ago. She declared with a triumphant sneer that the boy standing in my hospital room was carrying the true Reynolds bloodline. She pointed a sharply manicured finger across the room at my sleeping daughter and loudly proclaimed that Lily was nothing but a useless financial liability. Loretta stated that her son Brandon needed a legitimate strong male heir to carry on the family legacy, and my daughter was an unacceptable complication to their grand design. The delusion in her statement was absolutely staggering. The Reynolds family had no legacy. They had no vast generational fortune. They were essentially broke, hiding their massive debts behind leased luxury vehicles, heavily mortgaged suburban properties, and exclusive country club memberships they could barely afford to maintain. My private trust fund was the only real source of wealth keeping their pathetic facade alive. Loretta continued her vicious tirade, turning to praise Melanie as a traditional woman who truly understood the sacrifices necessary to build a powerful family. She looked back at me and spat that I was far too obsessed with my corporate career to ever be a proper submissive wife. She claimed that my independence had forced Brandon to look elsewhere for a real woman who actually respected him. Then came the ultimate gaslighting performance to cap off their invasion. Melanie, wearing an incredibly expensive designer dress that was undoubtedly paid for by my husband using our joint accounts, suddenly burst into highly theatrical tears. She dropped to her knees right beside my hospital bed, clasping her hands tightly together against her chest in a grotesque mockery of desperate prayer. She began to sob loudly, begging me to just step aside peacefully for the sake of the children. She claimed that little Leo desperately needed a complete family under one roof, and that I was the evil barrier standing in the way of their true love. She spun a ridiculous fabricated narrative about being a fallen socialite who just needed a generous chance to rebuild a stable home for her innocent son. Brandon immediately rushed forward, placing a fiercely protective hand on Melanie's shaking shoulder. He glared down at me as if I were a literal monster actively torturing this poor defenseless woman. He demanded that I stop being so incredibly selfish and think about the greater good of the Reynolds bloodline. The psychological manipulation they were attempting was intense, carefully designed to completely break my grip on reality and force me into a hysterical breakdown. When I absolutely refused to react, when I refused to cry, beg, yell, or even defend myself, Brandon grew visibly frantic. He realized I was not giving them the chaotic emotional response they desperately needed to justify their cruel narrative to the outside world. In a sudden, highly aggressive move, Brandon reached rapidly across my bedside table and snatched my personal smartphone right off the charging dock. He shoved the device deep into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, loudly declaring to the room that I was clearly suffering from a mental break and was not in my right mind. He announced that I needed to be isolated from the outside world for my own safety. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew my phone contained the direct encrypted lines to my entire legal team, my personal wealth managers, and my private security firm. By taking it, he firmly believed he was cutting off my only oxygen supply. He thought he had successfully severed my connection to my resources, leaving me utterly defenseless and entirely at his mercy for the extortion. Loretta sneered at me one final time, grabbed the weeping Melanie firmly by the arm, and ordered Brandon to leave me there to rot until I was ready to cooperate. They turned in unison and walked out of the recovery room, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind them with a resounding thud. I was left completely alone in the quiet, sterile hum of the maternity ward. I was bleeding, physically exhausted from major surgery, and entirely phoneless. I slowly turned my head and looked over at the far wall where Loretta had aggressively shoved my daughter. Lily was still sleeping peacefully in her plastic bassinet, completely unaware of the absolute monsters that had just violently invaded her first day in this world. I slowly pushed myself up against the stiff hospital pillows, gritting my teeth and completely ignoring the burning, tearing pain in my lower abdomen. Brandon truly thought that stealing my personal phone was a brilliant checkmate. He completely forgot that a top-tier corporate restructuring attorney never ever enters a high-stakes environment without a secure backup plan already in place. I looked at the sleek designer diaper bag resting on the corner chair, knowing exactly what was hidden beneath the receiving blankets. The opening moves of their pathetic game had concluded, and now it was my turn to play. 10 miles away from my sterile hospital room, my husband was busy desecrating my sanctuary. My $4.5 million Manhattan penthouse, with its sweeping views of Central Park and custom Italian marble floors, had been purchased entirely with my inheritance. It was my fortress. Now it was the staging ground for an absolute mockery of my life. Brandon and his mother Loretta had brought Melanie and her son Leo directly to my home to host a lavish welcome party for the newly declared heir. They did not just step into my house, they invaded it. Brandon immediately began popping bottles of my vintage champagne, pulling them from the climate-controlled cellar I had painstakingly curated. He ordered an extravagant spread of catered seafood and Wagyu beef entirely charged to my secondary platinum card. While I lay bleeding and isolated, Brandon paraded his mistress through my living room, acting as though he had single-handedly conquered the world. The sheer audacity of throwing a celebration for a hidden child on my property using my financial resources was a testament to his staggering delusion. He truly believed he had won. He believed that by stealing my phone, he had effectively cut the puppet strings, leaving me paralyzed. He poured champagne for Melanie, kissing her forehead while she admired the panoramic city views. Loretta strutted across the hardwood floors, barking orders at the catering staff and rearranging my expensive decor to suit her own tasteless preferences. She was already treating the penthouse as if it were her own personal estate, gleefully imagining the permanent eviction of her corporate daughter-in-law. The elevator doors chimed, opening directly into the private foyer of the penthouse. Out stepped Trisha Brandon's older sister and her husband, Malik Davis. Trisha had always been the quiet one in the Reynolds family, constantly overshadowed by her brother's golden child status. But her marriage to Malik was the one thing Loretta and Brandon secretly despised the most. Malik was a brilliant black man who served as the chief compliance auditor for a major federal bank. He possessed a mind engineered for numbers patterns and absolute legal accountability. He was a man of impeccable integrity, which inherently made him a threat to a family built on financial smoke and mirrors. Loretta immediately zeroed in on Malik the second he stepped off the elevator. Her face contorted into a mask of polite yet venomous condescension. She practically sprinted across the room, grabbing Malik by the arm and forcibly steering him away from the main gathering of high society guests she had hastily assembled. She pointed a sharp finger toward the marble island where the catering staff had set up a makeshift bar. She loudly instructed Malik to stand behind the counter and make himself useful by serving drinks to the real guests. She made a pointed, degrading comment about how he needed to earn his keep since he clearly did not fit the social demographic of the room. It was a blatant, racist humiliation designed to strip him of his dignity and remind him of his place in her twisted hierarchy. Malik did not raise his voice. He did not cause a scene or give Loretta the aggressive reaction she so desperately craved. He simply adjusted his tailored suit jacket, offered a polite nod, and stepped behind the marble counter. He understood the assignment. He knew that arguing with a narcissist was a waste of breath. But Malik was a federal auditor and a man who spent his life dismantling white-collar criminals. He did not need to yell to exert power. He simply needed data. While pouring bourbon for a guest, Malik reached into his leather briefcase beneath the counter. He pulled out his encrypted compliance iPad. It was a highly specialized device equipped with network diagnostic tools he used to track banking fraud. Because he was connected to the penthouse local network, Malik casually ran a background diagnostic sweep just to see what the Reynolds family was hiding. What he found immediately triggered his professional instincts. The network logs showed heavy, unusual traffic originating from Brandon's personal laptop in the master bedroom. Malik narrowed his eyes, tapping the screen to trace the digital footprint. Brandon was not mingling with his guests. He was actively attempting to bypass a heavily encrypted firewall on a series of offshore investment accounts. Malik quickly recognized the account structures. They were my private trust accounts. Brandon was desperately trying to force his way into my financial fortress, utilizing a series of brute force password attempts and illegal routing protocols. The data told a terrifying story. Brandon was not a wealthy portfolio manager celebrating his new heir. He was a cornered rat frantically trying to drain my assets before the impending legal fallout. Malik watched the screen as Brandon's laptop pinged a rejection notice from the banking server. The desperation of the attack revealed a massive underlying vulnerability. Malik dug slightly deeper, utilizing his federal compliance access to run a quick background query on Brandon's recent financial activities. The results populating on his iPad were nothing short of catastrophic. Brandon was drowning in a sea of predatory loans owed to offshore betting syndicates and unregulated lenders. The lavish lifestyle, the custom suits, the expensive champagne, it was all a carefully constructed house of cards built on toxic debt and my stolen credit. Malik stood behind his bar polishing a crystal glass with absolute precision. He watched Loretta cackle loudly with her friends, completely unaware that her son was actively committing federal wire fraud in the next room. He watched Melanie sip my vintage champagne, pretending to be a wealthy socialite. The entire family was participating in a massive criminal conspiracy against a woman who was currently fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Malik did not say a word to Trisha. He knew he needed ironclad proof before making a move. He silently engaged a data mirroring protocol on his iPad, capturing every single keystroke and network request originating from Brandon's laptop. He bundled the evidence into a secure encrypted file, locking it behind a biometric firewall. While the Reynolds family celebrated their twisted victory in my home, they failed to realize they had invited a federal auditor directly into the center of their crime scene. Malik poured another drink, his eyes scanning the room with the cold calculation of a man preparing an indictment. He knew exactly what he possessed. He had the digital weapon required to annihilate Brandon's entire existence, and he knew exactly who needed to receive it. He just had to wait for the perfect moment to deliver the payload. I would soon learn exactly what transpired inside my home office while I lay confined to that hospital bed. Malik later provided me with the complete unedited audio recordings from his security devices, and the details were staggering. Brandon had quickly realized that his brute force cyber attacks against my banking firewalls were entirely futile. My wealth management team employed military-grade encryption that a desperate portfolio manager could never bypass. Sweating and trembling with mounting panic, Brandon abandoned his laptop in the master bedroom and crept down the hallway toward my private study. He locked the heavy oak door behind him, believing he was secure. He completely ignored the fact that my office was equipped with a voice-activated dictation system that Malik had easily synced to his own compliance tablet earlier that evening. Brandon frantically dialed a number on his burner phone, pacing across my imported Persian rug. The man on the other end of the line was a disreputable defense attorney known for handling extremely toxic financial liabilities. The audio captured Brandon breathing heavily, his polished Wall Street facade completely crumbling into pathetic desperation. He told the shady lawyer that the digital transfer had failed and that his offshore creditors were threatening physical violence. Brandon had accumulated $900,000 in illicit gambling debts owed to a highly aggressive Las Vegas betting syndicate. He had leveraged his professional reputation to borrow money he never possessed, and the syndicate had given him a strict 48-hour deadline to deliver the funds. If he defaulted, they would not just break his legs, they would take their evidence of his wire fraud straight to the federal authorities and the Portfolio Management Board. The lawyer calmly instructed Brandon that his only remaining option was a physical override. He needed a fully executed power of attorney, specifically granting him unrestricted liquidation rights over my primary private trust. Brandon argued that I was currently in the hospital, refusing to cooperate, and that my legal team would block any standard request. The lawyer coldly replied that Brandon had a pen and knew what my signature looked like. The implication was clear. Brandon needed to commit outright federal document forgery. He needed to fabricate a complete legal authorization and submit it directly to the bank before my corporate team noticed the breach. Brandon ended the call and immediately began rummaging through my mahogany desk drawers. He pulled out a stack of my previous legal filings, desperately searching for a clear example of my signature to trace. He found a blue ink pen and a blank sheet of paper. The audio picked up the frantic scratching of the pen as he repeatedly practiced forging my name. He was a man backed into a corner, willing to risk a massive federal prison sentence, simply to maintain his fraudulent lifestyle and protect his unearned status. He muttered to himself, cursing my independence and blaming me for his own catastrophic failures. He genuinely believed that because we were legally married, he was inherently entitled to drain my late father's hard-earned fortune to save his own pathetic skin. He was so intensely focused on perfecting the curve of my signature that he completely failed to hear the office door handle turn. Trisha had been looking for him, wanting to ask a simple question about the catering arrangements. When she pushed the door open, she walked directly into the center of a federal crime scene. She froze in the doorway, her eyes darting from the scattered legal documents to the burner phone, to the blue ink staining the side of Brandon's trembling hand. She recognized the power of attorney form immediately. She was not a lawyer, but she possessed enough basic financial literacy to understand exactly what her brother was attempting to do. Trisha asked him what he was doing with my private trust documents. Brandon jumped violently, dropping the pen onto the desk. He scrambled to cover the forged signatures with a blank folder, snapping at her to get out of his office. Trisha did not retreat. She stepped further into the room, her voice rising in disbelief. She accused him of trying to steal from his wife while she was bleeding in a hospital bed. She looked at the frantic calculations scrawled on his notepad and realized the horrifying truth. She demanded to know how much money he actually owed. When Brandon refused to answer, telling her to mind her own business, Trisha pulled out her phone. She firmly declared that she was calling the police because she would not stand by and watch her own brother commit a felony against a woman who had already done so much for their family. Before Trisha could dial a single digit, Loretta burst into the office. My mother-in-law had heard the rising voices over the noise of the penthouse party and had rushed down the hallway to intervene. She took one look at the forged documents on the desk, the phone in Trisha's hand, and the panicked sweat on Brandon's face. Loretta did not ask for an explanation. She knew exactly what her golden child was doing, and she fully supported it. She lunged forward and slapped Trisha hard across the face. The sharp crack of the impact echoed clearly on the audio recording. Loretta screamed at her own daughter, calling her an ungrateful traitor. She pointed a shaking finger at Trisha and delivered a vile racist tirade that cemented her absolute moral bankruptcy. Loretta shrieked that Trisha had ruined her social status the moment she chose to marry a black auditor. She told Trisha that she had no right to judge anyone in that room because she had tainted the family image. Loretta fiercely defended Brandon's theft, claiming that he was saving the entire Reynolds legacy. She insisted that my money was their money and that taking it was his absolute birthright as the man of the house. She ordered Trisha to keep her mouth shut and get out of the penthouse if she could not support her brother's survival. Standing perfectly still in the shadowed hallway just outside the open office door was Malik. He had followed his wife to ensure she was safe around her toxic family. He heard the slap. He heard the horrific racist insults spat by the woman who had smiled in his face at his wedding. He heard the definitive proof of a massive financial conspiracy targeting my assets. Malik did not rush into the room to confront them. He was a master of compliance and auditing. He knew that an emotional confrontation would yield absolutely nothing. Instead, he looked down at his encrypted tablet. He had the mirrored network data proving the cyber attack. He now had the audio recording proving the document forgery and the physical assault. He had everything required to dismantle the Reynolds family brick by brick. Malik quietly turned and walked back toward the elevator. It was time to send the payload to the one person capable of executing the final judgment. Meanwhile, I was still confined to my recovery bed in the maternity ward, staring at the ceiling tiles and calculating my next move. The physical pain from the surgical incision was intense, but my mind was completely clear. I knew Brandon would not stop at simply taking my smartphone. His arrogance always made him sloppy, and his current financial desperation would undoubtedly force him to make a critical legal error. I carefully shifted my weight and reached for the designer diaper bag resting on the visitor chair beside my bed. Beneath a stack of receiving blankets and newborn clothes, I had concealed my firm-issued encrypted laptop. I had instructed my legal assistant to pack it specifically for this exact scenario. I powered on the device and bypassed the hospital public network, connecting directly to my private cellular hotspot. As the secure server loaded, I prepared to initiate a defensive financial protocol that would freeze every single asset attached to my name. I was about to begin the legal slaughter when a notification chimed on my screen. It was an incoming heavily encrypted file from an unknown sender. The subject line contained a specific auditing code used only by federal compliance officers. The sender was Malik, and he had just handed me the absolute destruction of my husband on a silver platter. I clicked open the encrypted attachment using my secondary authentication key. The screen flooded with meticulously organized data files, audio recordings, network diagnostic logs, and high-resolution scans of forged financial documents. Malik had not just sent me a warning, he had compiled a comprehensive federal-grade dossier of criminal activity orchestrated by my own husband and mother-in-law. I pressed play on the first audio file. The unmistakable sound of Brandon frantically negotiating with a predatory Las Vegas betting syndicate echoed through my sterile hospital room. He was begging for a 48-hour extension on a $900,000 gambling debt. He promised the aggressive loan sharks that he was currently securing full power of attorney over my private trust. The sheer pathetic nature of his voice negotiating my hard-earned wealth to save his own kneecaps replaced any lingering physical pain I felt with pure calculated adrenaline. The next file was even more damning. It was the clear audio recording of Loretta slapping Trisha across the face inside my personal home office. I listened as my mother-in-law viciously insulted Malik using abhorrent racist language, explicitly declaring that marrying a black man had ruined her daughter's social standing. Loretta then openly admitted to a massive financial conspiracy, validating Brandon's theft, and proudly confirming their intent to drain my family inheritance. They genuinely believed my money was their birthright. Malik had captured every single keystroke of Brandon's failed cyber attack against my banking firewalls. The digital footprint was undeniable proof of attempted wire fraud and federal financial tampering. My husband was a cornered, desperate predator, and I now possessed the exact ammunition required to legally annihilate him. As I finished reviewing the final document, the heavy wooden door to my recovery room slowly creaked open again. I quickly minimized the encrypted window and slid the laptop back beneath the stack of receiving blankets. I let my head loll back against the stiff hospital pillows, intentionally half closing my eyes and slowing my breathing to mimic a state of deep narcotic sedation. Loretta slipped into the room, her heavy fur coat rustling softly. She had returned alone. She crept toward the side of my bed, pulling a folded stack of papers from her designer handbag. It was the same post-nuptial agreement Brandon had demanded I sign earlier. She also held a small black ink pad. They had realized that obtaining my conscious signature was impossible, so they were resorting to a forced biometric authorization. Loretta stood over me, her breathing shallow with anticipation. She reached out and roughly grabbed my right wrist, attempting to pry my thumb toward the ink pad. She whispered a venomous insult, calling me a stubborn fool who was about to lose everything. The absolute audacity of this woman physically assaulting a recovering surgical patient in a federal medical facility was staggering. She pressed the ink pad against my thumb, staining my skin black. As she moved to force my print onto the signature line of the fraudulent contract, I abruptly opened my eyes and locked my gaze directly onto hers. I did not flinch or pull away immediately. I simply stared at her with the cold, dead expression of a predator watching a rat walk willingly into a steel trap. Loretta gasped and stumbled backward, dropping the ink pad onto the linoleum floor. Her face drained of color as she realized I was completely lucid. I calmly reached over to the bedside table, grabbed a sterilized medical wipe, and meticulously cleaned the ink from my thumb. I told her in a perfectly even voice that attempting to forcefully extract a biometric signature from a heavily medicated patient constituted felony assault and aggravated fraud under New York state law. I informed her that the hospital corridor cameras had recorded her entering my room alone, and the resulting physical evidence would guarantee her a minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Loretta recovered her arrogant facade almost instantly. She sneered and crossed her arms, claiming I was bluffing and possessed absolutely no power to stop them. She boasted that Brandon was already finalizing the liquidation of my assets and that my precious Manhattan penthouse was currently hosting a lavish celebration for the true Reynolds heir. She turned toward the door, promising to return with Brandon to finish the job. She had absolutely no idea that her son was already financially dead. The moment the door clicked shut, I pulled my laptop back out and brought up my secure banking portal. As a corporate restructuring attorney, I wielded top-tier administrative authority over my own private trust. I did not need to make a single phone call or wait for a judge to sign a preliminary order. I simply navigated to the emergency security protocols. I typed in my master override password and initiated a total emergency asset freeze. I systematically revoked every single secondary user privilege attached to my name. I locked the primary checking accounts, froze the corporate expense lines, and entirely disabled the platinum credit cards resting inside Brandon's custom leather wallet. Within 40 seconds, the entire Reynolds family financial ecosystem was completely deactivated. Their limitless access to my wealth vanished into thin air. On Fifth Avenue, Brandon stood inside an expensive designer jewelry boutique. He leaned against a display case, admiring a flawless $150,000 diamond ring. He had promised Melanie the ultimate symbol of his unwavering commitment and planned to purchase the stone using my secondary platinum card. The sales associate politely took the card and swiped it through the terminal. The machine beeped harshly. The screen flashed a red rejection notice. Declined. Brandon scoffed, blaming a banking error, demanding the associate run the card again. The machine rejected the transaction a second time, locking the account entirely due to suspected fraudulent activity. As Brandon screamed, his phone vibrated. The board of directors informed him his trading license was suspended, and he was terminated forever. The architect of this precise financial execution was not just myself, safely operating from a hospital bed. The groundwork for his total destruction had been laid hours earlier inside my own home by a man the Reynolds family fundamentally underestimated. While I was isolated in the maternity ward, the penthouse had been transformed into a grotesque celebration of my husband's infidelity. Tricia and her husband, Malik Davis, had arrived at the party under the guise of family obligation. Malik was a brilliant black man who served as the chief compliance auditor for a major federal bank. He possessed a mind engineered for numbers patterns and absolute legal accountability. He was a man of impeccable integrity, which inherently made him a threat to a family built on financial smoke and mirrors. The elevator doors chimed, opening directly into the private foyer of my Manhattan penthouse. The space was crawling with high society guests, hired caterers, and the overwhelming stench of stolen wealth. Brandon and Loretta were parading Melanie and her son Leo around as if they owned the very marble beneath their feet. Tricia tensed beside her husband, instantly recognizing the profound disrespect unfolding in my home. She wanted to confront her mother immediately, but Malik placed a calming hand on her lower back. He observed the room with the cold, detached precision of a predator sizing up a fragile ecosystem. Loretta immediately zeroed in on Malik the second he stepped off the elevator. Her face contorted into a mask of polite yet venomous condescension. She despised Malik. She despised his success, his intellect, and most of all his race. In her twisted, archaic worldview, a successful black man did not belong in her fabricated upper-crust reality. She practically sprinted across the room, grabbing Malik by the arm and forcibly steering him away from the main gathering of high society guests she had hastily assembled. She pointed a sharp finger toward the massive kitchen island where the catering staff had set up a makeshift bar. Loretta loudly instructed Malik to stand behind the counter and make himself useful by serving drinks to the real guests. She made a pointed, degrading comment about how he needed to earn his keep since he clearly did not fit the social demographic of the room. She smiled while she said it, ensuring the nearby guests heard her vile microaggression. It was a blatant, racist humiliation designed to strip him of his dignity and remind him of his place in her twisted hierarchy. Malik did not raise his voice. He did not cause a scene or give Loretta the aggressive emotional reaction she so desperately craved. He knew that arguing with a narcissist was a profound waste of breath. As a federal auditor who spent his life dismantling aggressive white-collar criminals, he understood that true power never required shouting. He simply adjusted his tailored suit jacket, offered a polite nod, and stepped behind the marble counter. He understood the assignment perfectly. He would serve the drinks. He would remain completely invisible to the arrogant socialites mingling in my living room. But while they drank my stolen champagne, Malik prepared to serve them absolute legal devastation. He positioned himself behind the bar, blending seamlessly into the background of the lavish party. He poured expensive bourbon into crystal glasses, handing them to oblivious guests, who did not even bother to make eye contact with him. Under the counter, safely hidden from view, Malik reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out his heavily encrypted compliance iPad. This was a highly specialized device, equipped with military-grade network diagnostic tools he routinely used to track banking fraud across international borders. Because he was a trusted family member, his device automatically connected to the local secure network of my penthouse. Malik casually ran a background diagnostic sweep. He did not expect to find anything specific initially. He just wanted to see what digital trace the Reynolds family was leaving behind. What he found immediately triggered his professional instincts. The network logs populating on his screen showed heavy, incredibly unusual traffic originating from a specific IP address within the penthouse. Malik tapped the screen, tracing the digital footprint. The signal was coming from the master bedroom. He glanced around the crowded living room and noted a crucial detail. Brandon was nowhere to be seen. The supposed man of the hour, the proud new father, was absent from his own celebration. Malik narrowed his eyes and focused entirely on the data stream flowing across his tablet. Brandon was actively attempting to bypass a heavily encrypted firewall on a series of offshore and domestic investment accounts. Malik quickly recognized the security architecture of the account structures. They were my private wealth management portals. Brandon was desperately trying to force his way into my financial fortress, utilizing a series of brute force password attempts and illegal routing protocols. The data told a terrifying and pathetic story. Brandon was not a wealthy portfolio manager celebrating his new heir. He was a cornered rat frantically trying to drain my assets before the impending legal fallout. Malik watched the screen as Brandon's laptop pinged a rejection notice from the banking server. My accounts were locked tight, but Brandon kept trying switching tactics and employing aggressive, unauthorized software to crack the passwords. The desperation of the cyber attack revealed a massive underlying vulnerability. Malik dug slightly deeper, utilizing his federal compliance access to run a quick background query on Brandon's recent financial activities. The results were nothing short of catastrophic. Brandon was drowning in a sea of predatory loans owed to offshore betting syndicates and unregulated lenders. The lavish lifestyle, the custom suits, the expensive champagne. It was all a carefully constructed house of cards built on toxic debt and my stolen credit. Malik stood behind the bar, polishing a crystal glass with absolute precision. He watched Loretta cackle loudly with her friends, completely unaware that her golden son was actively committing federal wire fraud in the next room. He watched Melanie sip my vintage champagne, pretending to be a wealthy socialite while funding her illusion with stolen money. The entire family was participating in a massive criminal conspiracy against a woman who was currently fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Malik did not say a single word to Trisha. He knew he needed ironclad, irrefutable proof before making a formal move. He silently engaged a data mirroring protocol on his iPad, capturing every single keystroke and network request originating from Brandon's laptop. He bundled the evidence into a secure encrypted file, locking it behind a biometric firewall. While the Reynolds family celebrated their twisted victory in my home, They failed to realize they had invited a federal auditor directly into the center of their crime scene. Malik poured another drink, his eyes scanning the room with the cold calculation of a man preparing an indictment. He had the digital weapon required to annihilate Brandon's entire existence. I would soon learn exactly what had transpired inside my home office while I lay confined to that hospital bed. Malik later provided me with the complete unedited audio recordings from his security devices, and the details were staggering. Brandon had quickly realized that his brute force cyber attacks against my banking firewalls were entirely futile. My wealth management team employed military-grade encryption that a desperate portfolio manager could never bypass. Sweating and trembling with mounting panic, Brandon abandoned his laptop in the master bedroom and crept down the hallway toward my private study. He locked the heavy solid oak door behind him, believing he was secure. He completely ignored the fact that my office was equipped with a voice-activated dictation system that Malik had easily synced to his own compliance tablet earlier that evening. Brandon frantically dialed a number on his burner phone, pacing across my imported Persian rug. The man on the other end of the line was a disreputable defense attorney known for handling extremely toxic financial liabilities. The audio captured Brandon breathing heavily, his polished Wall Street facade completely crumbling into pathetic desperation. He told the shady lawyer that the digital transfer had failed and that his offshore creditors were threatening physical violence. Brandon had accumulated $900,000 in illicit gambling debts owed to a highly aggressive Las Vegas betting syndicate. He had leveraged his professional reputation to borrow money he never possessed, and the syndicate had given him a strict 48-hour deadline to deliver the funds. If he defaulted, they would not just break his legs, they would take their evidence of his wire fraud straight to the federal authorities and the Portfolio Management Board. Brandon practically begged the lawyer into the receiver. He needed immediate liquidity. He explained that he tried to execute a backdoor wire transfer from my primary index funds into a shell escrow account, but my firm had flagged the routing number. The lawyer coldly responded that digital embezzlement against a top-tier restructuring attorney was a suicide mission. My multi-factor authentication protocols and biometric locks made a remote drain completely impossible without triggering a federal alert. The lawyer demanded to know why Brandon had not simply forced me to sign the post-nuptial agreement at the hospital. Brandon frantically explained that he had tried, but I was unresponsive and heavily medicated. The lawyer let out a sharp sigh of sheer frustration, warning Brandon that the Vegas syndicate did not care about my medical status. They only cared about clearing the $900,000 ledger by the end of the business week. The lawyer calmly instructed Brandon that his only remaining option was a physical override. He needed a fully executed power of attorney specifically granting him unrestricted liquidation rights over my primary private trust. With a notarized power of attorney, Brandon could walk directly into the main branch, bypass the digital security entirely, and authorize an irrevocable wire transfer, citing my medical incapacitation as the reason for his sudden administrative control. Brandon argued that I was currently in the hospital refusing to cooperate, and that my legal team would block any standard request. The lawyer coldly replied that Brandon had a pen and knew exactly what my signature looked like. The implication was abundantly clear. Brandon needed to commit outright federal document forgery. He needed to fabricate a complete legal authorization and submit it directly to the bank before my corporate team noticed the breach. Brandon ended the call and immediately began rummaging through my mahogany desk drawers. The audio picked up the frantic shuffling of papers and the opening of filing cabinets. He pulled out a stack of my previous legal filings, desperately searching for a clear, pristine example of my signature to trace. He found a blue ink fountain pen and a blank sheet of paper. He printed out a standardized power of attorney template from the internet. The audio captured the frantic scratching of the pen as he repeatedly practiced forging my name on scrap paper. He was a man backed into a tight corner, willing to risk a massive federal prison sentence simply to maintain his fraudulent lifestyle and protect his unearned status. He muttered to himself, cursing my independence and blaming me for his own catastrophic failures. He genuinely believed that because we were legally married, he was inherently entitled to drain my late father's hard-earned fortune to save his own pathetic skin. He convinced himself that I owed him this money for tolerating my demanding career. His delusion was absolute. He rationalized the forgery as a necessary business transaction to secure the future of his new son. He told himself that once the Vegas syndicate was paid off, he could finally live the lavish life he deserved with Melanie, using the remaining liquidated assets from my accounts to fund his new family. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, completely consumed by the meticulous task of copying the exact loop and slant of my cursive handwriting. He scrutinized the pressure points of the ink, ensuring the fabricated signature would pass a cursory inspection by a junior bank teller. He planned to leverage his own status as a respected portfolio manager to speed up the verification process. Brandon knew that if he walked into the financial institution wearing his custom-tailored suit and carrying the forged document, the tellers would likely defer to his authority. He intended to exploit the patriarchal bias of the banking system, projecting the image of a concerned husband managing his incapacitated wife's affairs. Every stroke of the pen was a calculated step deeper into a federal crime. He meticulously filled in the authorization clauses, specifically targeting the high-yield mutual funds and the liquid cash reserves I held in a secondary holding account. He explicitly avoided the heavily monitored trust accounts managed by my firm, knowing those would trigger immediate red flags. Instead, he aimed for the liquid capital I used for rapid real estate acquisitions. The $900,000 he needed was sitting there, perfectly accessible if the forged document held up. He was so intensely focused on perfecting the final curve of my signature that he became entirely deaf to his surroundings. He completely failed to hear the office door handle slowly begin to turn. The heavy oak door was not as secure as he believed, and his arrogant assumption of absolute privacy was about to be his ultimate undoing. The trap I had not even needed to set was springing closed around him, driven purely by his own intense greed and reckless desperation. Trisha pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping directly into the dimly lit study. She had come down the hallway simply to ask a question about the catering invoice for the obnoxious party happening in my living room. Instead, she walked directly into a scene of absolute financial desperation. Brandon froze instantly in place. The blue ink fountain pen slipped from his sweaty fingers, clattering onto the mahogany desk. He scrambled to throw a blank manila folder over the scattered papers, but he was too slow. Trisha saw the bold heading of the power of attorney document. She saw my name practiced on the notepad. She saw terror consuming her brother's face. Brandon tried recovering his posture, standing up and aggressively adjusting his suit jacket. He ordered Trisha out of my private office, claiming he was handling highly sensitive corporate matters for me while I recovered in the hospital. Trisha did not retreat. She possessed enough basic financial literacy to recognize what a forced asset transfer looked like. She stepped further into the room, her eyes darting from the burner phone to the blue ink staining Brandon's hand. She asked him point-blank why he was forging my signature. Brandon sneered, telling her to mind her own business, stepping forward to intimidate her. He tried gaslighting her, insisting she was overreacting to standard wealth management procedures. Trisha refused to back down. She pointed at the forged documents, loudly accusing him of trying to steal from his wife while she bled in a maternity ward. She demanded to know how much money he actually owed to resort to outright felony fraud. When Brandon lunged forward to grab her arm, Trisha swiftly stepped back, pulling her smartphone from her clutch. She firmly declared she was calling the police right now because she would not stand by and watch her brother commit a federal crime against a woman who had done nothing but support their family. She began dialing the emergency number, her hands shaking, but her resolve unbroken. Before Trisha could press the call button, Loretta burst into the office like a hurricane of toxic rage. My mother-in-law had heard the escalating argument and rushed down the corridor to intervene. Loretta took one quick look at the chaotic scene. She saw the forged legal documents, the sweat pouring down Brandon's face, and the phone clutched tightly in Trisha's hand. Loretta did not ask for an explanation. She knew exactly what her golden child was attempting to do, fully supporting his criminal endeavor. Without a single second of hesitation, Loretta lunged across the imported rug, slapping Trisha violently across the face. The sharp crack of the physical impact echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Trisha stumbled backward, dropping her phone, pressing a hand to her stinging cheek in absolute shock. Loretta stood over her daughter, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She screamed at Trisha, calling her a worthless, ungrateful traitor to her own blood. Loretta pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Trisha, delivering a vile, racist tirade, cementing her absolute moral bankruptcy. Loretta shrieked into the quiet room. "You married a black auditor and ruined your status. Do not you dare touch a cent of this money. Brandon is saving this family legacy." Loretta doubled down on her horrific delusion. She openly defended Brandon's theft, claiming he was doing what was necessary, protecting the Reynolds bloodline. She insisted my money was their money, and taking it was his absolute birthright as the man of the house. Loretta screamed that Trisha had tainted the family image the moment she walked down the aisle with Malik. She viciously declared Trisha had no right to judge anyone because she had already disgraced their supposed high society standing. She ordered Trisha to keep her mouth shut, pick up her phone, and get out immediately if she could not support her brother's survival. Brandon stood behind his mother, completely silent, letting her do his dirty work. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, looking relieved. The physical violence stopped Trisha from making the call. He turned his attention back to the forged documents, treating his sister's assault as a minor inconvenience in his grand scheme. Trisha looked at her mother and brother with pure disgust. She finally saw them for the monsters they truly were. Standing perfectly still in the shadowed hallway just outside the partially open office door was Malik. He had followed his wife down the corridor, wanting to ensure she was safe around her highly volatile family members. He heard the sharp slap. He heard the horrific racist insult spat by the woman who smiled falsely in his face at his wedding. He heard the definitive proof of a massive financial conspiracy targeting my personal assets. Malik did not rush into the room to confront them. He was a master of compliance and auditing. He knew an emotional confrontation would yield absolutely zero results against raging narcissists. Instead, Malik looked down at his encrypted tablet. He already possessed the mirrored network data proving Brandon's cyber attack against my banking firewalls. Now he had the audio recording proving the document forgery and the physical assault. He had everything required to dismantle the Reynolds family brick by brick. Malik felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over him. They despised him for his race, and they betrayed me for my money. He quietly turned and walked back toward the private elevator. It was time to send the payload to the one person capable of executing the final judgment. He navigated through the crowd of oblivious party guests, his face a perfect mask of professional composure. Malik stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the lobby. As the door slid shut, he initiated a secure upload sequence on his device. He targeted my emergency email address. He handed me the keys to my vengeance. The Reynolds family thought they held power, but they ignored the silent auditor watching their every move. I lay perfectly still in the sterile hospital bed, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The physical pain from the emergency surgical delivery radiated through my lower abdomen, but my mind operated with absolute icy clarity. Brandon genuinely believed that confiscating my smartphone neutralized my ability to fight back. He assumed I was just a helpless, exhausted mother trapped in a recovery room without a lifeline. He severely misjudged the woman he married. As a corporate restructuring attorney handling multi-billion-dollar liquidations, I never operated without a fail-safe. I slowly pushed myself up against the stiff pillows, ignoring the sharp burning sensation of my incision. I reached over to the visitor chair where my sleek diaper bag rested. Beneath a carefully arranged stack of receiving blankets, I had instructed my legal assistant to conceal my firm-issued encrypted laptop. I slid the device onto my lap and powered it on. I bypassed the unsecured hospital wireless network entirely and connected directly to my private cellular hotspot. The screen illuminated, casting a pale blue glow across the darkened room. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password and authorized the biometric scan. Within seconds, I successfully logged into my law firm's highly secure internal server. I navigated to my administrative portal, preparing to initiate a defensive financial protocol that would freeze every single asset attached to the Reynolds name. Before my fingers could even strike the execution keys, a sudden notification chimed softly from my inbox. A heavily encrypted email had just dropped into my priority queue. The subject line contained a specific auditing code utilized exclusively by federal compliance officers. I recognized the formatting instantly. I used my secondary authentication key to decrypt the incoming payload. The sender was Malik Davis. My brother-in-law had just bypassed standard communication channels to send me a direct secured transmission from his federal tablet. I opened the message and read the short, decisive text attached to the data file. Malik wrote that they disrespect him for his race, and they betray me for their greed. He stated firmly that I should let him be my star witness in federal court. A sharp surge of vindication washed over me. Malik had witnessed the horrific abuse inside my penthouse, and he had actively chosen to cross family lines to deliver absolute justice. I clicked on the attachment and watched as a comprehensive federal-grade dossier downloaded onto my screen. Malik had not just sent me a warning. He had provided me with the ultimate weapon to destroy my husband. I opened the first folder and began scrolling through the meticulously organized data. Malik had mirrored the entire local network of my penthouse. I stared at the irrefutable digital footprints of Brandon's frantic cyber attack against my banking firewalls. The logs showed dozens of failed brute force password attempts originating directly from Brandon's laptop. I listened to the crystal-clear audio recordings Malik had captured from my home office. Hearing my mother-in-law hurl vile racist insults at Malik while defending Brandon's criminal theft disgusted me to my core. I listened to Brandon desperately negotiating his $900,000 gambling debt with the predatory Las Vegas betting syndicate. His pathetic whimpering voice confirming his intent to forge my signature on a power of attorney document filled me with pure, calculated rage. He was planning to drain my liquid capital to save his own legs from being broken by loan sharks. However, the most devastating piece of evidence was hidden in the final folder of the compliance audit. I opened a series of scanned financial documents that Malik had extracted from Brandon's hidden digital cache. My breath caught in my throat as I examined the fabricated paperwork. Brandon had not just attempted to hack my private trust accounts. He had already successfully executed a massive financial crime months earlier. Staring back at me was a fraudulent mortgage application. Brandon had secretly leveraged my late father's sprawling suburban estate. The property had been fully paid off for decades, a pristine asset held perfectly secure in my family trust. Brandon had somehow bypassed the initial security checks and forged my signature to extract a massive line of credit against my childhood home. He had stolen millions right from under my nose to fund his pathetic illusion of Wall Street dominance and to buy expensive gifts for a mistress. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal transcended simple infidelity. He was actively attempting to dismantle my entire generational legacy to cover his toxic failures. He had mortgaged the very house where my father had raised me. Every single memory I held in that home had been violated by Brandon's insatiable greed. He had brought his mistress and his hidden son into my Manhattan penthouse, while simultaneously leveraging my suburban estate. The arrogance required to execute such a complex web of financial deceit was staggering, but his arrogance was exactly what caused his fatal error. He left digital breadcrumbs that a skilled federal auditor like Malik could easily track and compile. I sat in the quiet hospital room, my newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her bassinet just a few feet away. I stared at the glowing screen, absorbing every single detail of the federal audit logs. I memorized the dates, the account numbers, the exact amounts of the forged loans, and the names of the aggressive offshore creditors. I compiled the evidence into a streamlined legal brief, preparing the exact sequence of events for my rapid retaliation. I had the undeniable proof of his embezzlement, his document forgery, and his massive bank fraud. I closed the email and opened my direct communication line to my law firm, I attached the audio files, the network logs, and the fraudulent mortgage documents. I drafted a swift, merciless directive instructing my team to contact the federal authorities, the Financial Crimes Unit, and the Banking Commission immediately. The trap was fully loaded, and the execution was officially in motion today. The trap was fully loaded, and the execution was officially in motion today. I watched the confirmation banner flash across my screen, verifying that my legal team had received the encrypted transmission. A wave of intense physical exhaustion suddenly washed over me, crashing through the adrenaline that had been keeping me alert. My body temperature was rising steadily, a post-surgical fever setting in, and making my skin feel tight and unnaturally hot. I quickly powered down the encrypted laptop and slipped it back into the depths of the designer diaper bag, pulling the receiving blanket securely over the top. I leaned my head back against the stiff hospital pillows, pulling the thin cotton sheet up to my chin. My vision blurred slightly from the combination of the rising fever and the lingering effects of the narcotic painkillers the nurses had administered earlier. I closed my eyes, allowing my breathing to slow into a deep, rhythmic pattern. I needed to rest to conserve every ounce of strength for the impending fallout. I drifted into a light, feverish sleep, but my senses remained hyper-aware of my surroundings. The maternity ward was typically quiet during this hour, with only the muffled sounds of medical carts rolling down the linoleum hallway. Then I heard the heavy wooden door of my recovery room slowly creak open. The hinges whined softly, breaking the silence. I did not open my eyes or alter my breathing. I waited, listening as a set of expensive heels clicked quietly against the floor. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, lacking the soft, rubber-soled efficiency of the hospital nursing staff. Someone had sneaked past the nurses' station and entered my private room. The distinct scent of heavy floral perfume and stale cigarette smoke permeated the sterile air. It was Loretta. My mother-in-law had returned alone. I kept my eyelids shut tight, maintaining the illusion of a completely incapacitated patient. Through my peripheral senses, I could feel her looming over my bed. She stood there for a long moment, watching my chest rise and fall. She was assessing my vulnerability, calculating whether I was deeply sedated enough to pull off her despicable plan. I heard the sharp rustle of thick paper being pulled from a leather handbag. She set something down on the rolling tray table beside my bed. Loretta muttered under her breath, whispering a venomous insult about how weak and pathetic I looked. She called me a stubborn fool who was about to lose everything I had ever worked for. She was absolutely certain she held all the power. The sheer audacity of this woman entering a federal medical facility to prey on a recovering surgical patient was staggering, but entirely on brand for the Reynolds family. I heard the distinct plastic snap of a small container being opened. It was a biometric ink pad. They had realized that obtaining my conscious written signature on the forged power of attorney was impossible, so they were resorting to a forced thumbprint authorization. Brandon had clearly sent his mother to do the dirty work while he remained at my penthouse, attempting to maintain his facade of wealth. Loretta leaned over the bed, her breathing shallow with anticipation. I could feel the heat of her anger radiating toward me. She reached out and roughly grabbed my right wrist. Her long, manicured nails dug painfully into my skin. She possessed a shocking amount of physical strength fueled by pure, unfiltered greed. She attempted to yank my arm out from under the hospital blankets, pulling my hand toward the rolling tray table where she had laid out the fraudulent asset transfer documents. She aggressively tried to pry my thumb away from my curled fist, aiming to press it directly onto the black ink pad. The physical assault snapped my corporate restructuring instincts fully awake. This was a direct felony. She was actively committing aggravated battery and fraud. I did not flinch or cry out in pain. I abruptly opened my eyes and locked my gaze directly onto hers. I violently ripped my arm out of her grasp, utilizing the sudden surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. Loretta gasped loudly, a sharp sound of pure shock escaping her throat. She stumbled backward, her expensive heels catching on the linoleum floor. She collided with the tray table, knocking the black ink pad onto the ground where it clattered loudly. Her face completely drained of color as she realized I was completely lucid and staring right at her. I did not speak immediately. I simply sat up slightly, ignoring the searing pain in my abdomen, and stared at her with the cold, dead expression of an apex predator watching a rat walk willingly into a steel trap. Her initial shock quickly morphed into defensive rage. Loretta recovered her arrogant posture, smoothing down the front of her expensive fur coat. She sneered at me, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. She hissed that I was making a massive mistake by fighting them. She boasted that Brandon was already finalizing the liquidation of my assets and that my precious Manhattan penthouse was currently hosting a lavish celebration for the true Reynolds heir. She threatened that if I did not cooperate and willingly hand over the biometric authorization, they would ensure I never saw my daughter again. She claimed Brandon had the best family lawyers in the city, ready to declare me an unfit mother due to severe psychological instability. Loretta gloated, standing in my hospital room, completely convinced she was delivering a masterful checkmate. She smiled a cruel, twisted smile, promising to return with Brandon to finish the job once they secured a court order mandating my compliance. She turned her back on me and marched toward the door, brimming with unearned triumph. She had absolutely no idea that her golden child was already financially dead. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I had just forwarded a federal compliance audit to the authorities. She thought she was leaving a broken woman behind to suffer. She did not realize she had just walked directly into a financial slaughterhouse and handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to lock her in a federal penitentiary. I watched the door swing shut behind her, the heavy latch engaging with a definitive click. I reached over to the bedside table, grabbed a sterilized medical wipe, and meticulously cleaned a tiny smudge of black ink from my index finger. The fever still burned beneath my skin, but my mind had never been sharper. Loretta wanted a war over my assets, and she thought brute force would win it. I adjusted my hospital gown and calmly reached back into the diaper bag to retrieve my laptop. I had one final defensive mechanism to activate before Brandon realized his entire world had just been erased. I opened the encrypted laptop and stared at the glowing screen. Loretta had not completely left the hallway. She pushed the heavy hospital door back open, stepping one foot inside the room to deliver a final venomous threat. She told me I had exactly 1 hour to reconsider my stubbornness before Brandon initiated a hostile divorce proceeding that would leave me with absolutely nothing. She sneered that my daughter and I would be destitute by morning. I did not argue with my mother-in-law. I did not raise my voice or offer a single syllable of defense against her pathetic intimidation tactics. I simply kept my eyes locked on my monitor. My legal team had prepared the documentation perfectly, based on the federal audit logs Malik had securely transmitted. As a top-tier corporate restructuring attorney, I possessed the highly specialized legal credentials required to bypass standard bureaucratic delays in the Manhattan federal court system. I opened the secure judicial portal and reviewed the ex parte emergency injunction. It was a comprehensive legal nuke designed to instantly paralyze illicit financial movements. I verified the attached evidence of Brandon's wire fraud and his forged mortgage application. Everything was absolutely flawless. I brought my finger down on the trackpad and firmly hit execute. I watched the green progress bar flash across my screen. The confirmation code generated, instantly illuminating my face in the darkened recovery room. A massive digital shockwave was officially deployed into the financial sector. I knew exactly what was happening inside the banking mainframes across the city in that precise second. Algorithmic locks were violently engaging. Swift network codes were communicating directly with the primary financial institutions holding the Reynolds family wealth. I watched my administrative dashboard as the sweeping freeze took effect. The joint checking accounts completely drained of access. The high-yield savings portfolios were instantly frozen behind impenetrable federal firewalls. The exclusive Black Centurion credit cards, which formed the absolute foundation of Brandon's fake elite status, were instantaneously bricked. Every single line of credit attached to the Reynolds name, from their luxury vehicle leases to their country club memberships, was now flagged and entirely paralyzed under a federal mandate. The automated system locked down their entire financial ecosystem in a matter of seconds. The wealth they had proudly flaunted, the money they had relentlessly weaponized against me, vanished into the digital ether. I looked up from my laptop screen and met Loretta's furious gaze. She was still standing in the doorway, waiting for me to break down and beg for her mercy. I kept my facial expression completely relaxed and my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I told her she should check her banking app right now. Loretta scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes at what she assumed was a desperate bluff from a defeated woman. She arrogantly reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. She opened her private wealth management application, expecting to see the massive liquid balances she felt inherently entitled to control. I watched her smug expression slowly transform. The arrogant sneer melted into absolute confusion and then rapidly shifted into stark, terrifying panic. She tapped the glass screen frantically. Red warning banners flashed across her display, reflecting in her wide eyes. Zero available credit. Account suspended pending federal review. Please contact your primary administrator. Loretta breathed in sharply, her chest heaving as she refreshed the application over and over again. She tapped the screen with shaking manicured fingers, praying it was a simple network error. The same red banners glared back at her. She opened a secondary banking app linked to her personal checking account. Frozen. She checked the joint corporate expense account she shared with Brandon. Terminated. She looked up at me, her jaw trembling, and demanded to know what I had done to her money. I closed my laptop with a definitive, sharp snap. I calmly explained the brutal reality of her new existence. I told her that I had just executed an emergency asset freeze through the federal court. I detailed how every single cent she and Brandon had access to was now legally locked in an impenetrable vault, pending a massive criminal investigation. I reminded her that the lavish welcome home party currently happening in my Manhattan penthouse was entirely unfunded. I informed her that the expensive caterers serving her high society friends would not be paid. The vintage champagne her son was pouring for his mistress could no longer be covered by my platinum card. Loretta shrieked that I had absolutely no right to touch their family wealth. She screamed that she would have me thrown in jail for financial sabotage. I kept my voice dangerously soft. I clarified that it was never their money. I told her the financial lifeline keeping the Reynolds family afloat had been permanently and legally severed. I explained that she was currently standing in a hospital room, wearing a fur coat she could no longer afford, holding a smartphone connected to a cellular plan that would bounce the next payment. She gripped the door frame, her knuckles turning white as the catastrophic reality crushed her delusional worldview. The power dynamic had shifted so violently and so rapidly that her brain could barely process the destruction. She had walked into my room treating me like helpless prey, and now she realized she was the one caught in a lethal trap. I stared her down, refusing to look away. I told her to run back to her golden child and let him know that the restructuring phase had officially begun. Loretta spun around and bolted down the hospital corridor, her expensive heels slipping clumsily against the polished linoleum floor as she desperately tried to dial Brandon's number. While Loretta was fleeing the maternity ward in a state of absolute terror, her golden child was standing inside a private viewing room at an exclusive Fifth Avenue jeweler. Brandon had slipped away from the lavish penthouse party, leaving Melanie and his secret son to enjoy the catered seafood. He stood in front of a velvet display tray, examining a flawless $150,000 diamond engagement ring. He planned to return to my penthouse, gather the high society guests, and propose to Melanie in the center of my living room using my money. He smiled arrogantly at the impeccably dressed sales director, boasting about his massive portfolio returns and his demanding life on Wall Street. He wanted the staff to treat him like royalty. He casually pulled my secondary platinum card from his custom leather wallet and dropped it onto the glass display case with a theatrical flick of his wrist. He instructed the sales director to wrap the ring immediately because he was in a rush to get back to his celebration. The sales director offered a polite deferential nod and picked up the heavy metal card. He stepped over to the secure payment terminal and inserted the chip. Brandon leaned against the counter, admiring his own reflection in the mirrored pillars, already imagining the look on Melanie's face when he presented the massive stone. A harsh electronic beep shattered the quiet elegance of the boutique. The sales director frowned slightly, looking down at the screen. He pulled the card out, wiped the chip carefully, and inserted it a second time. Another loud, abrasive beep echoed through the room. The terminal display flashed a bright red error code. The director cleared his throat, apologizing profusely, and informed Brandon that the transaction had been declined. Brandon let out an exaggerated sigh of annoyance, adjusting his silk tie. He aggressively scolded the employee, claiming the store network must be malfunctioning. He loudly announced that the account held millions in liquid capital and demanded the man run the charge again immediately. The director complied, but this time the machine printed out a small white receipt. The text on the paper clearly stated the account was completely frozen under a federal security mandate. Brandon snatched the receipt from the counter, his face flushing with immediate rage. He began shouting at the sales director, causing other wealthy patrons in the boutique to turn and stare in shock. He slammed his fist against the glass display case, demanding to speak with the general manager. He screamed that he was a top-tier portfolio manager and that they were insulting a highly valued client. He threatened to buy the entire store just to fire everyone working there. The sales director remained perfectly calm, taking a step back and quietly signaling the armed security guards standing near the entrance. They moved forward, resting their hands on their utility belts, ready to escort the irate customer out onto the street. Brandon grabbed his platinum card off the counter, waving it frantically in the air. He shouted that he would simply call his private wealth manager to clear the trivial security hold. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, intending to unleash his fury on the banking representatives. Before Brandon could even unlock his screen, the device began vibrating aggressively in his hand. The caller identification displayed the private executive line for the board of directors at his wealth management firm. Brandon immediately straightened his posture, forcing his face into a mask of professional composure. He assumed they were calling to congratulate him on the birth of the new Reynolds heir. He answered the call, projecting his usual arrogant tone. Instead of warm congratulations, he was met with the cold, clinical voice of the firm's chief legal officer. The executive wasted absolutely no time. He informed Brandon that the entire board was currently sitting in an emergency session reviewing a comprehensive federal compliance audit they had just received. Brandon felt the blood completely drain from his face as the lawyer listed the exact details of the file. The board possessed the mirrored network logs showing his attempted cyber attack against my banking firewalls. They had the audio recordings of him negotiating predatory loans with a Las Vegas betting syndicate. They had irrefutable proof of the forged mortgage application he had executed against my father's suburban estate. They possessed every single digital footprint documenting his relentless greed and the undeniable fact that he had weaponized his corporate access to commit outright financial theft. The chief legal officer then delivered the final devastating blow. He announced loudly that Brandon was terminated effectively immediately. His access to the main corporate building was permanently revoked, and building security was currently packing his office belongings into cardboard boxes. The executive explicitly stated that the firm had already forwarded the entire compliance dossier to the Financial Crimes Unit of the federal authorities. Furthermore, Brandon's portfolio management license was indefinitely suspended pending a massive criminal investigation. The line went completely dead, leaving Brandon staring blankly at the dark screen. The reality of his absolute destruction crashed down upon him. He was standing in a luxury jewelry store with a useless credit card, a suspended license, and federal agents likely already building a case against him. He frantically opened his personal banking application, hoping to transfer whatever small funds he had left into an offshore shell account. The screen loaded, revealing the exact same catastrophic red warning banners his mother was currently staring at in the hospital corridor. His balance read absolute zero. The account was locked by a strict emergency judicial order. Total financial panic seized his chest, making it entirely impossible to breathe. The trap had slammed shut, closing off every single exit. He realized he had just lost his entire career, his pristine social standing, and his access to my generational wealth. He dropped the useless mobile phone onto the pristine marble floor in complete despair. While Brandon stared at his shattered phone on the jewelry store floor, my own hospital room was about to become the staging ground for his final absolute ruin. I lay in my recovery bed reviewing the confirmation emails from my legal team. The emergency asset freeze was holding perfectly across all global networks. The heavy wooden door to my room swung open again, but this time it was not my panicked mother-in-law returning to hurl empty threats. It was Malik. He stepped inside and closed the door firmly behind him, locking the deadbolt with a definitive click. His presence radiated a quiet, absolute authority. He wore his tailored suit with the calm, calculating demeanor of a man who had just successfully executed a high-level federal sting operation. He walked over to my bedside and placed a thick, sealed manila envelope onto my rolling tray table. He did not offer empty sympathies or ask how I was feeling physically. He knew we were in the middle of a ruthless corporate war, and he treated me like the commanding general. Malik stood at the foot of my bed and adjusted his jacket. He explained that while Brandon was busy playing a wealthy tycoon and Loretta was actively hurling racist insults at his expense, he had utilized his high-level federal security clearance to pull a comprehensive forensic background check. He reached out and opened the heavy folder, sliding a certified laboratory document directly into my line of sight. He stated plainly that the child Loretta had so proudly paraded through my recovery room was not a Reynolds. The private DNA test Loretta claimed to have commissioned earlier that month was a complete fabrication heavily manipulated and forged by Melanie. Malik had pulled the actual medical records and genetic markers from a secure national database. Little Leo possessed absolutely zero genetic connection to my husband. Brandon had destroyed his entire career, his marriage, his reputation, and his freedom for a child that did not even belong to him. I stared at the certified lab results, feeling a sharp spike of pure vindication. The sheer magnitude of their collective stupidity was staggering. Loretta had violently shoved my newborn daughter aside to make room for a child entirely unrelated to her bloodline. She had actively participated in a massive criminal conspiracy to steal my generational wealth, all to secure a legacy that was literally a biological lie. But Malik was not finished delivering the absolute destruction of their pathetic illusion. He pulled out a second stack of heavily redacted federal documents, dropping them onto the table. He revealed the absolute masterpiece of the deception they had fallen for. He stated that the woman currently sipping my vintage champagne in my Manhattan penthouse was not a struggling single mother or a fallen socialite. Her real name was not even Melanie. She was born Melissa Vance, and she was currently legally married to a diesel mechanic residing in Austin, Texas. She possessed an extensive and highly active criminal record across 3 different states, primarily for wire fraud, identity theft, and high-level extortion. Malik tapped the federal background check with his index finger, outlining her true financial motive. She was never actually interested in building a life with Brandon. She was currently engaged in a massive shadow extortion campaign against a highly prominent Dallas real estate tycoon who she claimed was the actual biological father of her child. Brandon was nothing but a convenient temporary financial shield. Melanie had expertly targeted his desperate need to feel powerful and his obsessive desire to project an image of extreme wealth. She used him to completely fund her lavish lifestyle, providing her with expensive designer clothing, luxury dinners, and secure housing, while she meticulously built her blackmail case against her actual target. The irony was incredibly delicious. Brandon and Loretta believed they were the ultimate apex predators, manipulating me to secure their financial empire. In reality, they were just easy marks being effortlessly played by a seasoned professional scam artist. They had blindly welcomed a hardened criminal into their home. They had physically assaulted their own family members, alienated their only successful relatives, and attempted to steal millions of dollars from my private trust, all to protect a woman who viewed them as nothing more than an open ATM. Malik explained that Melanie had a very specific pattern. She would latch on to insecure men with access to capital, drain their resources to fund her legal battles, and then vanish the moment the money stopped flowing. Since I had just initiated a total federal asset freeze and bricked all of Brandon's credit cards, her primary funding source was officially dead. Malik predicted that within the hour, Melanie would realize the accounts were locked and immediately attempt to flee the state before the local authorities could catch up with her. I looked up at Malik, a genuine smile breaking across my face for the first time since my emergency surgery. The physical pain in my abdomen faded completely into the background, entirely eclipsed by the brilliant strategic execution unfolding before me. Malik had handed me the final devastating weapon I needed to execute the ultimate public humiliation. He asked me what my next operational move would be. I closed the manila folder and handed it back to him, instructing him to keep the documents entirely secure. I told Malik that Brandon and Loretta would inevitably return to this hospital, looking to force my hand once they realized their financial ecosystem was destroyed. They would come looking for a terrified, submissive victim to bully into submission. I threw off the thin hospital blanket and swung my legs over the side of the bed, completely ignoring the protests of my recovering body. I informed Malik that it was time to change out of my hospital gown. I was not going to meet them as a recovering patient. I was going to meet them in the main hospital lobby as the corporate restructuring attorney who had just legally annihilated their entire existence. Malik offered a slight respectful nod, pulling his phone from his pocket to contact the federal agents waiting outside. The final act was officially underway. The heavy steel doors of the VIP recovery wing remained sealed tight, but the sheer volume of the chaos erupting on the ground floor easily penetrated the hospital's soundproofing. From my vantage point near the private elevator banks, I listened as Malik relayed the real-time security feed directly to my earpiece. The final act of their absolute destruction was playing out exactly as I had calculated. Brandon and Loretta had just violently breached the main hospital lobby. They did not walk through the automatic sliding glass doors. Brandon practically tore them off their electronic tracks. He was moving with the erratic, terrifying energy of a desperate animal cornered by a predator. His custom-tailored navy suit, which had looked so immaculate just hours earlier, was now completely disheveled. His silk tie was yanked loose around his neck, and dark sweat stains soaked through his expensive collar. He looked absolutely unhinged. Loretta was right on his heels, hyperventilating, as she furiously clutched her useless designer handbag against her chest. Her perfectly coiffed hair was windblown and chaotic. They shattered the peaceful, quiet atmosphere of the maternity reception area, an environment normally filled with joyful grandparents holding balloons and expecting fathers quietly filling out admission paperwork. Brandon marched directly up to the main reception desk and violently slammed his fist down onto the reinforced glass counter. He demanded immediate, unrestricted access to my private recovery suite. The head receptionist, a seasoned professional who was entirely unfazed by arrogant men in expensive suits, calmly asked him to lower his voice and produce a valid photo identification. Brandon completely exploded. He screamed that he did not need to show any identification to see his own wife. He pointed a shaking finger at the receptionist and loudly declared that I was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. He shouted to the entire crowded lobby that his wife had suffered a catastrophic mental break during surgery and was currently acting completely out of her mind. He claimed I was actively destroying their household by illegally withholding vital family funds and locking him out of his own banking portals. Loretta immediately joined the assault, weaponizing her false sense of authority. She shrieked at the hospital staff, threatening to sue the entire medical facility for holding her daughter-in-law hostage. She demanded that the security team override the electronic locks on the maternity ward doors immediately. She claimed it was a matter of life and death, insisting that I was deeply incapacitated and making dangerous, irrational financial decisions that needed to be stopped by my legal husband. She pointed her sharp, manicured fingers at the bewildered bystanders, demanding they stop staring and fetch the hospital administrator. Two large hospital security guards quickly stepped forward, placing themselves directly between the reception desk and my raging husband. They firmly instructed Brandon to step back and lower his voice, or he would be physically removed from the premises. Brandon, a man who had spent his entire adult life utilizing extreme privilege and fake wealth to bully service workers, completely lost his grip on reality. He tried to pull rank. He shouted that he was a senior portfolio manager at a top-tier firm. He screamed that his tax bracket single-handedly funded their paychecks and that he would personally ensure every single employee in the lobby was fired by morning. He demanded they force my door open. He yelled that he needed to get my signature on critical life-saving financial documents before my psychotic break caused irreparable damage to his estate. His desperation was palpable, radiating off him in waves of toxic panic. Every single second that ticked by meant the federal authorities were getting closer to his fraudulent mortgage applications and his massive Vegas gambling debts. He was suffocating under the weight of his own collapsing empire, and his only oxygen supply was locked behind a pair of reinforced hospital doors. Brandon paced back and forth in front of the security desk like a caged predator. He loudly quoted fabricated family law statutes, attempting to assert total patriarchal dominance over my medical autonomy. He screamed that a husband possessed the absolute legal right to override an unstable wife's financial directives. He yelled that the hospital was enabling a mentally ill woman to commit financial suicide. He demanded that the doctors drag me down to the lobby so he could take control of the situation and restore order to his accounts. The reaction from the surrounding crowd was immediate and highly damaging. Dozens of bystanders, patients, and visitors pulled out their smartphones. They began recording the spectacular public meltdown of the unhinged Wall Street executive in the ruined suit. The glowing lenses of camera phones surrounded Brandon and Loretta from every angle. Loretta panicked at the sight of the cameras. She realized her social reputation was currently bleeding out onto the hospital floor. She lunged forward wildly, swiping her hands at a bystander phone, screaming at them to stop recording her family crisis. Her aggressive physical reaction only made them look significantly more dangerous and erratic. The hospital chief of security arrived on the scene, an imposing calm man who refused to yield an inch to Brandon's aggressive posturing. He informed Brandon that the police had been called to handle a public disturbance. Hearing the word police sent another massive shockwave of terror through Brandon's system. He tried to physically push his way past the chief of security, throwing his shoulder forward in a desperate bid to reach the restricted elevator banks leading to my floor. The security guards instantly grabbed him by the arms, shoving him forcefully backward and pinning him against a concrete structural pillar. Brandon thrashed against their grip, completely unraveling in front of the recording crowd. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he needed immediate access to his money. He shrieked about the frozen accounts, the declined credit cards, and the locked portfolios. It was the most revealing moment of his entire pathetic existence. As he fought against the hospital security team, broadcasting his desperation to the entire city, he did not ask about my physical recovery from major surgery. He did not ask if I was safe. And not once, not a single time during his massive hysterical public rampage did he ask to see his newborn daughter. He only screamed for the money. He only begged for the assets. I listened to the final chaotic moments of his lobby assault through Malik's secure audio feed. The trap had worked flawlessly. Brandon had publicly established himself as an aggressive, unstable threat, attempting to force financial compliance from a hospitalized woman. I adjusted the cuffs of my elegant silk blouse, feeling the cool, sharp armor of my professional identity snap fully into place. I cradled my sleeping daughter carefully against my chest. I looked over at Malik and Trisha, who stood ready by the heavy double doors of the VIP ward. The time for silent observation was officially over. It was time to deliver the execution. The heavy double doors of the VIP maternity ward slid open with a smooth mechanical hiss. The chaotic noise of the hospital lobby instantly died down, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. I stepped forward into the harsh fluorescent light of the public arena. I was no longer a bedridden patient, recovering from a dangerous surgical delivery. I had completely discarded the flimsy hospital gown, exchanging it for a razor-sharp emerald silk blouse and tailored black trousers. I held my newborn daughter securely against my chest, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket. I stood at the top of the short ramp leading into the main reception area, projecting the absolute authority of a top-tier corporate restructuring attorney preparing to liquidate a worthless asset. I did not walk out alone. Flanking me on my right was Malik, looking every bit the ruthless federal compliance auditor he was. Beside him stood Trisha, her head held high, entirely severed from the toxic loyalty she once owed her blood relatives. Stepping out immediately behind us, forming an impenetrable wall of law enforcement, were four stern-faced federal agents representing the FBI and the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit. Their dark suits and gold badges instantly commanded absolute compliance from the crowd. The hospital security guards who had been aggressively pinning Brandon against the concrete structural pillar immediately stepped back, recognizing the overwhelming federal presence entering their jurisdiction. The sea of bystanders holding their glowing smartphones parted silently, clearing a direct, wide path for my squad to descend into the center of the lobby. Brandon stumbled forward, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The arrogant Wall Street facade he had spent his entire life carefully cultivating had completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but a sweaty, trembling shell of a man. His custom navy suit was a ruined, wrinkled mess. He stared at me in absolute shock. His fragile brain could simply not process the visual of his wife standing before him, looking immaculate and commanding a federal strike team mere hours after undergoing major abdominal surgery. He opened his mouth, attempting to launch into his rehearsed narrative about my supposed mental instability, but the vile words died in his dry throat. He looked at the federal agents, then back at the secure leather folder tucked firmly under Malik's arm. He took a staggering, uncoordinated step toward me, extending a shaking hand, trying to play the part of a desperately concerned husband. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I held my ground and stared at him with an expression of pure, freezing disgust. Loretta stood frozen near the main reception desk, her useless designer handbag slipping from her sweaty grasp and hitting the linoleum floor with a dull thud. Her eyes darted frantically between the flashing police badges and Trisha's defiant posture. She finally realized that the quiet black auditor she had viciously racially abused in my penthouse had just orchestrated her total legal annihilation. Her mouth hung open, but no sound emerged. She looked exactly like a trapped animal desperately searching for an exit that no longer existed. The catastrophic reality of the situation crashed down upon her, breaking her delusional belief that she could ever outsmart my legal expertise. She had walked into a hospital thinking she held the power of a queen, and now she was facing the brutal reality of becoming a federal inmate. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the silent lobby with surgical precision. I did not yell. I did not show a single ounce of emotional distress or marital heartbreak. I projected my voice so every single camera phone in the room picked up the legal charges perfectly clearly. I addressed Brandon directly, staring right through his panicked eyes. I stated that his attempted hostile takeover of my private trust was officially terminated. I informed him that he was no longer speaking to his submissive wife, but to the chief legal architect of his imminent incarceration. I began to cold-bloodedly recite the exact federal charges facing him and his mother. I announced the first count of federal document forgery, detailing loudly how he had locked himself in my private home office to illegally trace my signature onto a fraudulent power of attorney. I watched his jaw drop as he realized we possessed the audio recordings of his pathetic panic. I listed the second count of massive bank fraud, outlining his desperate attempts to bypass my encrypted banking firewalls using illegal routing protocols. I made sure the entire lobby heard that he was trying to pay off a $900,000 gambling debt owed to a predatory Las Vegas betting syndicate. The gasps from the surrounding crowd echoed loudly as his fake wealthy persona was publicly shredded into pieces. Finally, I delivered the heaviest killing blow, declaring the charge of attempted embezzlement of a $2.3 million trust. I explicitly stated that he had leveraged my late father's sprawling suburban estate, committing a massive financial crime to fund his pathetic illusion of wealth and to buy luxury gifts for a fraudulent mistress. I told him that the FBI agents standing right behind me already possessed the mirrored network data, the dictation audio files, and the forged mortgage applications. Malik stepped forward, handing a heavy encrypted flash drive directly to the lead federal agent. The transfer of evidence was seamless and incredibly damning. I watched Brandon's knees buckle slightly as the sheer weight of the federal charges crushed his last remaining sliver of hope. He realized he could not charm his way out of this disaster. He could not gaslight the FBI. He was standing in a public lobby completely surrounded by irrefutable proof of his own overwhelming greed and spectacular stupidity. The trap had sprung with flawless execution, permanently sealing his absolute fate. He had drastically underestimated the woman he married, and now he was going to pay the ultimate price for his massive betrayal. While federal agents closed a ring around Brandon and Loretta, the true architect of this domestic illusion calculated her escape route. Melanie stood near the periphery of the lobby, holding Leo by the hand. Seeing the gold badges of the Financial Crimes Unit, her demeanor shifted. The weeping socialite act evaporated. She was a hardened career criminal recognizing the momentum of a federal takedown. Brandon was finished. The well of my wealth she planned to siphon was cemented shut. Knowing that sticking around would inevitably lead authorities to run her fingerprints, she made her move. Looking down at the boy holding her hand, she realized Leo was a heavy anchor preventing her from moving quickly. With a chilling lack of maternal instinct, Melanie let go, abandoning her own child in the chaotic, crowded hospital lobby without a single backward glance. Leo stood there looking around in confusion while his mother adjusted the strap of her oversized designer tote bag. The bag was unnaturally bulky, weighed down by hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of my personal jewelry she had hastily swept from my penthouse vanity. Melanie took a careful step backward, using the recording bystanders as a human shield. Ducking her head, she slipped behind a row of potted palms, moving with the practiced stealth of a woman who had fled dozens of jurisdictions before. Her eyes darted toward the rear exit where automatic sliding doors led directly to a busy taxi stand. She picked up her pace, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the tile, distancing herself from the catastrophic implosion of the Reynolds family. She thought she was entirely invisible, slipping away with stolen diamonds. She severely underestimated Malik Davis. He analyzed her background check earlier that evening and knew exactly how her criminal mind operated. The moment the FBI agents engaged, Brandon Malik had strategically repositioned himself near the rear exit, anticipating her exact escape trajectory. Melanie reached the doors, letting out a breath of relief as the glass panels slid open. A broad shoulder clad in a perfectly tailored suit suddenly blocked her path. Malik stood squarely in the center of the exit, his arms crossed over his chest, projecting an immovable wall of absolute compliance. Melanie gasped, stumbling backward and clutching the stolen tote bag tightly against her side. She tried to resurrect her pathetic victim persona, forcing tears into her eyes and begging Malik to let her pass to escape the trauma of the lobby. Malik did not yield a single inch. He calmly stated her real legal name loudly enough for the surrounding security personnel to hear, informing Melanie that her performance was officially canceled. Reaching into his suit jacket, he produced a thick, folded legal document bearing the official seal of the Texas State Judiciary. With surgical precision, Malik unfolded the paper, holding it directly in front of her face. He announced that he was holding an active federal interstate arrest warrant issued out of Austin, Texas. He listed her active charges of severe wire fraud, high-level identity theft, and felony extortion. Pointing a firm finger directly at the heavy designer bag clutched in her sweating hands, he informed her that the hospital security cameras had just recorded her attempting to flee a federal crime scene while in possession of stolen high-value assets. Adding grand larceny to her existing interstate warrants would guarantee her a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security facility. The realization that she was completely trapped hit Melanie with the force of a freight train. The panic in her eyes instantly curdled into toxic, furious rage. The sweet, submissive demeanor she had used to completely blind Brandon vanished, revealing the aggressive, manipulative predator beneath. Realizing that playing the victim would not work against a federal auditor holding her arrest warrant, she turned around to face the main lobby, her chest heaving with furious breaths. Melanie locked eyes with the man who had destroyed his entire life to protect her. She did not offer him a look of sympathy or solidarity. Instead, she unleashed her absolute fury. Her shrill voice sliced through the noise of the crowded lobby, demanding everyone's attention. She pointed a shaking finger at Brandon and screamed with pure, venomous hatred, shrieking the exact words that would permanently shatter his fragile ego. "You are just a broke, pathetic loser. I never loved you." Melanie mocked his fake wealth, his leased cars, and his desperate need to feel important. She loudly confessed to the crowd that she had only used him because he was an arrogant, gullible mark, stupid enough to hand over his wife's money. She laughed harshly, stating that little Leo was the son of a real billionaire in Texas, and Brandon was nothing but a pathetic temporary pawn in her extortion scheme. I watched Brandon's face as the brutal truth physically impacted him. The final remaining pillar of his manufactured reality violently collapsed into dust. He had sacrificed his marriage, his highly lucrative career, and his entire legal freedom for a woman who viewed him as a pathetic joke. He realized the son he proudly claimed was just a prop used to drain his accounts. He realized the woman he violently defended felt absolutely zero affection for him. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. The federal agents moved in immediately, grabbing Melanie's arms and forcing her wrists behind her back. They stripped the designer bag from her shoulder, securing the stolen jewelry for evidence. She thrashed and cursed as the cold metal handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. Malik watched the officers secure the scam artist, offering a firm nod to the lead investigator. The gold digger who had invaded my home and attempted to steal my wealth was officially neutralized. Brandon stood utterly paralyzed, unable to speak a word. The entire hospital lobby had silently witnessed his mistress confirm his spectacular failure. He was completely broke, exposed, and forever despised by the very person he desperately tried to protect. The silence that followed Melanie being dragged through the automatic doors was heavy and absolute. The only sound remaining in the massive hospital lobby was the squeak of a medical cart and the heavy, ragged breathing of a man whose entire universe had just been systematically vaporized. Brandon stood completely motionless in the center of the tiled floor. His eyes darted wildly around the room, as if searching for a hidden exit or a friendly face to validate his existence. There was nothing. The federal agents blocking the exit offered only stern, unforgiving stares. The hospital security personnel, who had previously pinned him against the pillar, now watched him with naked disgust. The dozens of bystanders holding their phones had captured his entire downfall, broadcasting his absolute humiliation to the digital world. He slowly turned his head to look at his mother. Loretta had collapsed onto a rigid waiting room chair, her hands covering her face as she rocked back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. She could not offer him a single shred of protection or guidance. The matriarch who had fueled his arrogance was completely broken by the brutal reality of federal prison. Brandon finally looked back at me. He looked at the emerald silk blouse I wore. He looked at the cashmere blanket wrapped securely around our newborn daughter. He looked at the federal agents standing at my flank, ready to execute my legal directives. The final pieces of his shattered reality slotted into place. The portfolio management firm had stripped him of his title and suspended his trading license. The Manhattan Federal Court had frozen every single financial asset he relied upon to project his illusion of wealth. The Las Vegas betting syndicate was actively hunting him for the $900,000 debt he could no longer pay. The suburban estate he fraudulently mortgaged was completely flagged by the authorities. The mistress he had violently defended had publicly called him a pathetic loser. The boy he had proudly claimed as his genetic heir was the biological property of a Texas billionaire. He had absolutely nothing left, not a single cent, not a shred of dignity. The sheer gravity of his catastrophic failure finally severed his ability to remain standing. His knees simply gave out beneath the ruined fabric of his custom-tailored trousers. He dropped heavily onto the sterile white tiles of the hospital lobby. The sharp thud of his bones hitting the floor echoed clearly across the cavernous room. This was a man who had built his entire identity on dominating boardroom tables, intimidating waitstaff, and belittling his wife for her professional ambition. Now he was physically reduced to the lowest possible posture a human being could assume. He knelt in the center of the crowd, surrounded by flashing smartphone cameras breathing in frantic, shallow gasps. His broad shoulders shook violently as the first wave of hysterical sobs ripped from his throat. The tears ruined his perfectly manicured image, streaming down his face and soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. Brandon looked up at me from the ground. His face was contorted into a grotesque mask of pure desperation. He did not ask his mother for help. He did not look toward the exit. He fixed his bloodshot eyes entirely on me, realizing that the woman he had tried to extort just hours after major surgery was now his only remaining tether to salvation. He began to drag himself across the linoleum. He ignored the federal agents ordering him to remain exactly where he was. He crawled across the floor, moving with the frantic, uncoordinated motions of a drowning man reaching for a life raft. He closed the physical distance between us, dragging the knees of his expensive suit through the dust of a public walkway. He reached the bottom of the short access ramp where I stood holding our child. He lunged forward, extending his trembling hands. His sweaty fingers desperately grabbed the hem of my trousers, holding on with a pathetic white-knuckled grip. I did not move away. I simply stood there looking down at him from my elevated position, allowing the entire lobby to witness the depth of his groveling. Brandon buried his face against my shoes, weeping openly and loudly. He screamed my name, pleading with me to fix the disaster he had created. He begged me to call off the federal agents and unfreeze the banking portals so we could go home. He frantically promised that he would attend intensive therapy and dedicate his entire life to being a loyal, submissive husband. He offered to sign over his remaining personal possessions to me immediately. He babbled incoherently about how we could quietly resolve the mortgage fraud together without involving the criminal courts. He begged me. He swore that Melanie had bewitched him and that he was suffering from a massive lapse in judgment due to severe financial stress. His apologies were entirely self-serving, a desperate attempt to manipulate my empathy to save himself from a federal indictment. When I maintained my absolute silence, offering him absolutely no comfort or reassurance, his panic mutated into an entirely new form of manipulation. He looked up at the cashmere blanket resting against my chest. He fixated on the tiny sleeping form of the infant he had proudly rejected mere hours ago. He extended a shaking hand upward, his voice cracking as he sobbed hysterically. "Paige, please, I beg you. One more chance. Just let me hold our daughter." He wept, declaring that Lily was his only true child, and his only reason to live. He claimed he had been a fool and begged for the opportunity to prove himself as a loving father. The public humiliation was absolute and comprehensive. The arrogant portfolio manager was now a weeping, shattered mess, begging to hold a child he had previously called a biological inconvenience. He wept loudly, clinging to my ankles while the cameras recorded his total collapse. The physical sensation of his sweaty, desperate fingers gripping the fabric of my trousers sent a visceral wave of pure revulsion through my entire body. I looked down at the top of his head, watching his shoulders heave with pathetic, hysterical sobs. This was the exact same man who had confidently marched into my recovery room just hours earlier, wrapped in a custom-tailored suit and smelling of expensive cologne. This was the man who had arrogantly weaponized my medical vulnerability, attempting to extort my generational wealth while proudly flaunting a fraudulent mistress and a fake heir. Now he was nothing more than a ruined, terrified criminal, crying on a public floor because his financial lifeline had been permanently severed. He did not want his daughter. He wanted a shield. He wanted a prop to desperately leverage my empathy. He wanted access to the locked bank accounts that were currently the only thing standing between him and a federal penitentiary. I felt absolutely zero pity for the creature groveling at my feet. I felt no lingering marital affection, no heartbreak over a decade of wasted time, and certainly no desire to offer him a single ounce of comfort. I felt nothing but absolute chilling disgust. The emotional tether that had once connected me to this man had been surgically severed the moment he shoved that post-nuptial agreement onto my hospital bed. I was no longer looking at my husband. I was looking at a toxic liability that needed to be permanently liquidated from my portfolio. I did not kick him away. I did not raise my voice or engage in a physical struggle. I simply executed a perfectly smooth, calculated step backward. The sudden withdrawal of my physical presence removed his only anchor. Without the fabric of my trousers to cling to gravity, immediately took over. Brandon pitched forward heavily. He fell completely flat onto the sterile white linoleum of the hospital lobby. The sharp, humiliating smack of his chest and face, hitting the hard floor, echoed clearly through the massive room. He lay there sprawled out like discarded trash, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public defeat. I adjusted the cashmere blanket wrapped around Lily, ensuring she was perfectly secure against my chest. I looked down at the broken man lying prostrate on the tiles. My voice was dangerously quiet, but it carried the absolute weight of a judicial sentence. Every single camera phone in the lobby captured the exact cadence of my words. I told you to remember that moment in the delivery room. This child does not have a father named Brandon Reynolds. The words struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He let out a low, agonizing groan, pressing his forehead against the cold floor. The absolute finality of my statement completely shattered his desperate illusion that he could somehow manipulate his way out of this disaster by playing the role of a repentant father. I refused to let him hide behind a mask of sudden paternal devotion. I spoke clearly, deliberately, dismantling every single excuse he had just sobbed into the quiet lobby. I reminded him that he had looked at this beautiful, innocent newborn and called her a biological inconvenience. I stated loudly that he had explicitly refused to put his name on her birth certificate because he falsely believed he had secured a male heir with a seasoned scam artist. I stripped away his pathetic narrative that he was simply a fool who had suffered a lapse in judgment due to stress. I declared that his actions were entirely premeditated, calculated, and driven by an insatiable greed that had completely rotted his core. He had made his choices with absolute arrogance, and now he was going to suffer the consequences with absolute humiliation. I looked down at his trembling form and addressed his financial terror directly. I told him he was not crying because he had lost his family. I told him he was crying because the Las Vegas betting syndicate was coming to collect a massive debt he could no longer pay with my stolen money. I reminded him that the federal agent standing right behind me possessed the full audio recordings of his pathetic negotiations. I made it abundantly clear that my legal team was already processing the annulment based on his massive financial fraud and egregious breach of fiduciary duty. He would not receive a single cent of spousal support. He would not receive a settlement. He was walking out of this hospital with the exact same amount of wealth he had actually earned himself, which was absolutely zero. Loretta let out a sharp, ragged gasp from her chair near the reception desk. She watched her golden child lying flat on the ground, completely destroyed by the woman she had spent years trying to diminish. She finally understood that I was not the submissive target she thought she could easily manipulate. I had systematically dismantled her entire legacy in a single afternoon without ever raising my voice. I turned my head slowly and locked eyes with her for one final brief second. I gave her a cold, definitive nod, confirming that her reign of terror was permanently over. Her entire family tree had just been aggressively pruned from my life. Malik and Trisha immediately stepped forward, moving with synchronized precision to form a protective barrier between me and the ruined man on the floor. Trisha glared down at her brother with a look of pure, unbroken disdain. Malik adjusted his suit jacket, his posture projecting the unyielding strength of a man who had successfully exposed a massive criminal conspiracy. They closed ranks around me visually and physically, separating my new chosen family from the toxic wasteland of the Reynolds bloodline. The corporate restructuring was completely finished. I had successfully identified the hostile threat, isolated the financial vulnerabilities, and executed a flawless liquidation of the aggressive predators. The balance sheet of my life was now perfectly clean. I stood tall in the center of the brightly lit hospital lobby, holding the only person who truly mattered in my arms. Brandon remained motionless on the cold tile floor, sobbing uncontrollably into his own arms, fully realizing that he had just signed his own permanent death warrant. The surrounding crowd of patients, nurses, and visitors remained entirely frozen in place, actively processing the raw intensity of the confrontation. The glowing screens of their smartphones continued to record the unprecedented downfall of a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of stolen cash and arrogant lies. Nobody stepped forward to offer him a comforting hand. Nobody whispered a single word of sympathy for his pathetic display. He had publicly revealed himself as a manipulative monster, and the world was now treating him exactly as he deserved. I felt a sudden, refreshing wave of pure freedom wash over me, completely clearing away the lingering fog of my surgical recovery. The air in the lobby suddenly felt crisp and clean, entirely devoid of his suffocating toxic presence. I had won the war he foolishly started. I had protected my daughter from a lifetime of emotional abuse and financial instability. I looked down at Brandon one last time, cementing the visual of his total ruin into my memory before preparing to issue my final directive to the waiting federal agents. I looked down at Brandon one last time, cementing the visual of his total ruin into my memory before giving a sharp nod to the lead agent. The agent stepped forward, signaling his team to move. Two heavily armed officers advanced on Brandon, where he lay trembling on the sterile floor. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his ruined custom suit and hauled him to his feet with swift professional force. Brandon let out a pathetic gasp of pain as his arms were roughly wrenched behind his back. The cold, sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the cavernous hospital lobby. It was the definitive sound of a predator being caged. The lead agent leaned in close to Brandon's ear and began reciting his Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice that completely overpowered the murmurs of the surrounding crowd. He formally declared that Brandon was under arrest for federal bank fraud, massive wire fraud, and attempted extortion against a protected trust. Brandon squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head frantically side to side. He was completely powerless, a shattered facade of a man being aggressively restrained by the law enforcement system he thought he could effortlessly outsmart. Simultaneously, two federal agents flanked Loretta where she remained slumped. As the officers instructed her to stand, the arrogant matriarch finally snapped out of her shock. She leapt to her feet, her face flushed with indignation and panic. She shrieked that they were making a catastrophic mistake, demanding they unhand her immediately. Loretta violently swung her designer handbag at the nearest agent, attempting to fight off her arrest. The agents were entirely unfazed by her hysterical posturing. One agent swiftly deflected her swinging handbag, causing it to clatter across the floor and spill its expensive contents everywhere. He firmly grabbed her wrists, twisting them securely behind her back with practiced efficiency. The second set of handcuffs snapped shut, silencing her violent struggle. Loretta let out a piercing wail of disbelief as the cold steel bit into her skin. The agent loudly read her Miranda rights, charging her as a direct accomplice to federal forgery and financial extortion. The haughty woman who had shoved my newborn daughter's bassinet aside was now being paraded through a public lobby as a common criminal. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive fur coat dragged awkwardly across her restricted shoulders. She locked eyes with me one last time, her gaze filled with venomous hatred, but I merely offered her a cold, dismissive stare. She was completely broken. As the agents prepared to march the disgraced mother and son out through the main entrance, Tricia stepped firmly into their path. She raised her hand, signaling the officers to pause. The lead agent, recognizing Tricia as the key witness, allowed her a brief moment. Brandon looked at his older sister, his tear-streaked face suddenly filling with a pathetic glimmer of hope. He stupidly believed that Tricia was stepping forward to defend him, to use her husband's federal connections to negotiate a leniency deal. He opened his mouth to beg for her help. Tricia did not let him finish his sentence. She drew her hand back and delivered a resounding, brutal slap directly across Brandon's cheek. The impact sounded like a gunshot cracking through the tense silence of the lobby. Brandon staggered backward against the grip of the federal agents, his head snapping to the side from the force of the blow. Trisha stood over him, her chest heaving with years of suppressed anger and righteous indignation. She told him with absolute venom that he was a disgusting coward. She stated loudly that he had willingly destroyed his own family to feed his insatiable greed, and that he had allowed their mother to hurl racist abuse at her husband simply to cover his own pathetic financial failures. Trisha declared clearly and definitively that she was no longer his sister. She severed her blood ties completely, telling him that he and Loretta deserved exactly what was coming to them in federal prison. She turned her back on them both, standing shoulder to shoulder with Malik. The explosive sound of the slap, combined with the highly visible presence of federal law enforcement, had drawn the attention of the media. A swarm of local news reporters and aggressive freelance photographers suddenly flooded through the sliding glass doors of the lobby. The heavy camera flashes erupted like lightning, illuminating the humiliating arrest of the prominent portfolio manager. Journalists began shouting frantic questions, thrusting microphones toward Brandon's weeping face and asking about the massive embezzlement charges. The lobby instantly transformed into a chaotic media circus. The reporters quickly spotted me standing at the top of the ramp holding my daughter in my emerald blouse. They recognized me as the high-profile restructuring attorney at the center of the sudden scandal and immediately began surging forward, hoping to capture a lucrative statement. Before a single camera lens could focus on my face, Malik Davis moved with the swift protective precision of a highly trained operative. He stepped squarely in front of me, using his broad shoulders to create an impenetrable human shield. He raised his hands, firmly blocking the advancing journalists and loudly demanding they step back. Trisha mirrored his protective stance, flanking my left side and shielding Lily from the blinding flashes of the press cameras. Malik barked orders directing the hospital security team to establish a rigid perimeter around us. He placed a strong, reassuring hand on my back, guiding me away from the overwhelming chaos and the shouting reporters. The federal agents hauled a sobbing Brandon and a shrieking Loretta through the gauntlet of merciless media scrutiny, exposing their financial crimes to the entire city. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, ignoring the pathetic wails of the man I used to call my husband. Malik and Trisha safely escorted me down a secure side corridor, leaving the shattered remnants of the Reynolds family behind to face the devastating flashbulbs of their public execution. Malik guided us through the quiet, restricted corridor far away from the chaotic media circus, unfolding in the main reception area. The heavy soundproof doors muffled the frantic shouts of aggressive reporters and the pathetic sobbing of my former husband. The sterile, harsh scent of hospital antiseptic was suddenly replaced by a rush of crisp New York air as the private exit doors slid open. We stepped out onto the secure loading dock. The cool afternoon wind brushed against my face, instantly clearing the lingering fog of my surgical trauma. The sky above Manhattan was a brilliant, unobstructed blue, presenting the perfect backdrop for a complete corporate and personal reset. Parked precisely at the curb with its powerful engine purring silently, was a heavily armored, sleek black limousine. Malik had personally arranged the secure transport, ensuring my departure would be executed with the exact same flawless precision as my financial retaliation. A sharply dressed chauffeur immediately stepped forward, opening the heavy reinforced door and offering a highly respectful nod. He stood at strict attention, perfectly trained to ignore the massive drama radiating from the hospital building behind us. Trisha turned to me, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her posture remaining completely resolute. She wrapped her arms around me in a gentle embrace, mindful of my recovering surgical incision. She whispered that she was incredibly proud of me for forcefully dismantling the toxic structure that had suffocated her entire life. She thanked me for exposing the absolute rot at the core of the Reynolds legacy. I hugged her back, acknowledging that she had sacrificed her own biological ties to stand firmly on the side of justice and truth. I told her she would always possess a permanent place in my chosen family. Malik stepped up next, offering a firm professional handshake that seamlessly transitioned into a warm brotherly embrace. He had functioned as my ultimate weapon, my silent federal auditor who meticulously delivered the killing blow. I thanked him for his brilliant compliance execution. He simply smiled, adjusting his tailored lapel, and stated that protecting brilliant women from mediocre men was just a standard part of his job description. They stepped back, standing together as a united, formidable front, while the chauffeur gently guided me into the luxurious leather interior of the waiting vehicle. The heavy limousine door shut with a solid, definitive thud, instantly sealing out the relentless noise of the city. The interior was a secluded sanctuary of dark-tinted glass, rich mahogany accents, and absolute pristine silence. I settled into the plush leather seat, carefully adjusting my posture to accommodate the dull, burning ache lingering in my lower abdomen. The massive surge of adrenaline that had fueled my ruthless public execution was finally beginning to ebb away, leaving behind a profound physical exhaustion. However, the intense emotional relief coursing through my veins completely overpowered any physical discomfort. I looked down at the soft cashmere bundle resting securely against my chest. Lily was sleeping perfectly peacefully. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a steady, calming rhythm, completely unaffected by the massive destruction of the family empire that had just occurred mere feet away from her fragile form. She had slept entirely through the violent shouting, the federal arrests, the blinding camera flashes, and the pathetic groveling of the weak man who had callously rejected her. I gently stroked her soft, warm cheek, feeling an overwhelming surge of fierce maternal protection. I had actively engineered a multi-billion-dollar corporate bloodbath simply to guarantee that this innocent child would never have to endure a single second of manipulation from the Reynolds family. My ironclad boundaries had successfully saved my life and completely secured my daughter's long-term financial future. I had ruthlessly liquidated a highly toxic marital asset before it could drain my generational wealth. Brandon, Loretta, and Melanie were currently sitting in the cramped back seats of federal transport vehicles, facing decades in maximum security penitentiaries. They had wildly miscalculated their leverage, assuming that my postpartum vulnerability automatically equated to intellectual weakness. They foolishly believed they could strip my assets, forge my legal signature, and install a fraudulent heir without facing any aggressive resistance. Instead, they had been legally, financially, and socially annihilated. Their bank accounts were frozen, their reputations were destroyed, and their entire pathetic existence had been permanently reduced to a viral news story of extreme corporate greed and criminal stupidity. The sheer magnitude of their legal downfall served as a brutal testament to the consequences of crossing a restructuring attorney. I felt a profound sense of closure knowing the predators who sought to dismantle my life had ultimately orchestrated their own spectacular demise. My private trust remained completely untouched, safeguarded by the impenetrable firewalls I had activated from a recovery bed. The massive fortune my father had meticulously built was perfectly secure, ready to fund Lily's bright future instead of Brandon's dark gambling debts. I had successfully transformed from a targeted victim into the undisputed architect of my own absolute vengeance. The limousine pulled smoothly away from the hospital curb, gliding effortlessly into the bustling Manhattan traffic. I watched the towering glass skyscrapers pass by the tinted windows, feeling a profound sense of absolute ownership over my destiny. I knew the road ahead would require immense strength, but the heaviest chains binding me to a fraudulent past were finally broken. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the quiet victory of my complete independence. I was no longer the exhausted woman on a hospital bed. I was the sovereign ruler of my own meticulously protected empire. I carefully adjusted Lily in my arms, feeling her warm weight resting against my heart as we headed toward our secure, luxurious penthouse. The camera slowly fades as I look directly into the lens. In this society, kindness without boundaries and legal protection is just fresh meat for wolves. Have you ever had to sever blood ties to save your own life? Tell me in the comments below. The harrowing story of Paige's betrayal in the maternity ward offers a profound and chilling lesson. True security is never born from blind trust, but from unyielding boundaries and relentless self-reliance. Society frequently conditions us to view marriage and family as inherent safety nets, places where we can safely expose our deepest vulnerabilities. Yet Brandon's grotesque attempt to extort his wife, mere hours after she underwent major surgery, shatters this illusion completely. His actions prove that those closest to us can easily weaponize our weakest moments to serve their own desperate greed. The most empowering takeaway is how Paige navigated her survival. She did not waste her energy pleading with a narcissist or appealing to a morality he clearly lacked. Instead, she relied entirely on the impenetrable legal and financial fortress she had proactively built for herself. Her story teaches us that we must be the absolute architects of our own salvation. While love and empathy are beautiful traits, offering them without strict, tangible protections simply invites exploitation. Paige's ability to completely detach from her emotional trauma and execute a flawless, logic-driven counterattack is a masterclass in self-preservation. It reminds us that when a partnership inevitably devolves into a toxic liability, we must possess the fierce courage to sever those ties without a single ounce of guilt. Ultimately, we cannot control the actions or the hidden agendas of the people around us, but we can absolutely control our level of preparedness. By prioritizing our own independence, we ensure that no one can ever hold our future hostage. Evaluate the boundaries protecting your own life today and take the necessary steps to secure your independence before a crisis ever forces your hand.